It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, "By George, I think he's got it." Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? And welcome back to a podcast by George. Well, we've got kind of a revisit here today on the podcast. This is what I call tragedy in the heartland. This is a story that was on podcast by George once before, and I told you that we would come back to it because I ain't forgetting about this, and there's one guy I know that's never going to forget it. As a matter of fact, he's living it each and every day. He's going to join us here very shortly. But this news crossed the transom here just this week, and it was from Associated Press, and I'm going to read this news release, this story, and then I'm going to comment on it a little bit, and then we're going to introduce our guest. Now, this is from AP down in Jefferson City, Missouri. A former Missouri State Highway Patrol trooper who was driving a boat when a handcuffed Iowa man fell out and drowned in 2014 has dismissed 3 lawsuits he filed over losing his law enforcement license. Okay, now there's one thing that I learned about in journalism school and in my career as a journalist and certainly doing this podcast, and that is that each and every word matters. You got to put them down on paper. You got to think about them before you write them because they have really extreme significance in certain cases, and this is one of those stories. So here I just read you a paragraph. This is from the Associated Press, and right here it says that a handcuffed Iowa man fell out and drowned in 2014. Anthony Piercy filed to voluntarily dismiss his lawsuits against the patrol, the Department of Public Safety, and the department's director, the Missouri Attorney General's office said on Friday. Piercy's going to receive more than $200,000 for back pay for agreeing not to be reinstated to the patrol and not to protest the revocation of his peace officer's license. The agreement means Piercy cannot work in law enforcement in Missouri, the Jefferson City News Tribune had reported. Now, believe it or not, this Piercy guy had been fighting to regain his law's license since he pleaded guilty in 2017 to a misdemeanor boat violation. A misdemeanor boat violation in the 2014 death of Brandon Ellingson, 20 years old, of Clive. You've heard us talk about Brandon on the podcast before. And again, it says he fell into the lake of the Ozarks while in Piercy's custody. Ellingson was handcuffed and slipped out of an improperly secured life vest. The Department of Public Safety spokesman, Michael Connell, he declined to comment on Piercy's decision to dismiss the lawsuits. The News Tribune reported Piercy's attorney, of course, did not respond for comment. Okay, so that's the official accounting. I've got some exceptions with the wording of that and the way that it's written. I'll give you my account of this, and I'm going to bring Craig Ellingson in here to give us more of the details. But as I understand it, Brandon Ellingson was down there on a holiday weekend with friends. They were in a bar. This patrolman in a boat doing patrols down there in the party barges and party coves and all that type of thing was sitting out on this bar waiting for people to come out of it. And guy, they do this. And he went out and got Brandon and handcuffed him behind his back, completely unnecessary because all accounts were that he was polite and compliant. Put him in the back of the boat on a board, basically. Took off like a bat out of hell with his hands behind him and bounced him out of the boat. That's my understanding of what happened. And now he gets $200,000 in back pay. Can't practice law enforcement in Missouri any longer, and that's the way that I see it. That's the latest account from the Associated Press. Okay, so let's bring in the guy that really knows what's going on. It's the father of Brandon Ellingson and a friend of Podcast by George. It's Craig Ellingson. Good morning, Craig.
George, how you doing?
I'm doing all right. And again, I've just got the layman's understanding of this, but this story was of worldwide news for a while, and it's always been news across the entire country, and certainly here in the state of Iowa and where I live. And have I got the basics on this thing right?
Yeah, that's pretty much right. Basically, he handcuffed him and he moved him up next to him where he was driving the boat. and Brandon was standing next to him, and he had him handcuffed from behind, and he slid the jacket over the top of his shoulders, and I think he had there was two buckles on there. Brandon was a good size and well fit, and when he slid it over the top of him, he didn't secure it right. So he never put his arms through the holes. He just slid the jacket over the top of him, and that was the fatal mistake right there. And then he took off like a bat out of hell. Go back to the post to have Brandon take a breathalyzer and write him a ticket, basically, And that day was a real rough day, and they got him clocked going up to 46 mile an hour. And based on Piercy's deposition that I sat in, he hit a 7 foot wake, and as soon as he hit that wake, he turned into it to the left and stopped the throttle, put it all the way down. Well, that's like running into a brick wall. And when he did that, besides throwing it through Brandon, he didn't have nothing to hang on to, so it threw him up into the center console bars in that Donzi. And when he turned to the left at such a great speed and stopped with a sudden force, the centrifugal force just thrust Brandon out of the boat and into the bars and out to the right, outside of the boat. And then Piercy's boat continued to, sail by. The life jacket did pop off. Brandon had his chin on the life jacket. As Piercy tried to start his boat, he had it in gear, and he couldn't get it started because you have to have it neutral for the boat to start. He finally got it started, comes cruising back up next to him, and creates a lot of wakes, and then the jacket got floated away from his chin. And then after that, Piercy, people were watching this. There was a party barge boat with like 26 girls on it. These are their accounts. And they said they didn't know Brandon was handcuffed, and they saw Piercy stick a pole out to him and told him to grab it twice.
With his hands behind his back, handcuffed behind his back.
Yeah, and Brandon's treading water. And at that time, Brandon's not saying anything because I think he's really hurt because I think he hit his head. I don't think he did. And so anyway, he hit his head, and I think he was really, if not knocked out, he was really dazed, and probably had a concussion on top of it. But, after about 3 minutes, Piercy's jacking around trying to, hook him with his pole and pull him over, which he never did. But he was right there talking to Brandon, leaning over the boat. He could have grabbed him, they said, the girls, and he didn't. He never turned on his lights. He didn't have his camera cards in his boat, he says, which they're probably in the bottom of the lake. And he never asked for help. And so nobody really knew what was going on. There was lifeguards in that party barge boat. Those girls could have got out and saved Brandon. And finally, the girls were screaming at him to get out of the boat and save him because Brandon was going up and down out of the water. And they threw a dinghy out to him, and he didn't say nothing. And finally, Piercy jumped in, but it was too late. And the last time Brandon came up and went under, he said, "Oh my God!" So the last words out of his mouth were "God." So it's an eerie thing you have to live with the rest of your life, and just what he went through and what Piercy, if you know him as an individual, which I don't, but I've heard of people that talk about him, he's a pretty pathetic individual,
Well, and I think this plays into it a little bit. I know this is hard for you, Craig. And I don't know if you've ever thought along these lines, but and you're really close to this. I'm probably closer than I need to be. But I think sometimes, like these national news stories, when police officers are confronted by big black men particularly, and they overreact and they shoot them or they suffocate them, or 3 guys beat them to the ground and they don't need to. And it goes all the way back to the Rodney King circumstance. You think, well, why does that happen? Well, they're afraid. these law officers are. And I'll take this, extend this a little bit to Brandon's situation. Who was Brandon Ellingson? Brandon was captain of the football team. This guy was an all-star hockey player. He was a young man that was physically fit in the prime of his life, an athlete of some report. And here's this police officer, this state trooper from Missouri, morbidly obese and extremely poor physical condition. So he's got this kid, and he's got reason to be afraid. I mean, he couldn't handle him if he had to. Of course, he didn't have to, but he probably didn't know that. So why does he take off like a bat out of hell in that boat across the lake? Is he just stupid, or is he joyriding? I'm thinking to myself, no. What he was trying to do was subdue and intimidate Brandon a little bit simply by the roughness of the ride and the speed of the boat to try to control or contain him if he would ever want to get out of hand, because if he did, he would. I mean, with this guy. Have you ever considered that? Is that an angle that's worthy of exploration?
Yeah, I think Pierce he's a wannabe, and he was probably trying to intimidate Brandon maybe a little bit, but I think he was in a hurry. He was a guy who wanted to be at the top of the quota chain. He had his boss, Clarity, when they had a meeting, that we found out that in his review that he wanted to be the first guy to get a 20-20-20, which is 20 arrests on the water, on the road, and 20 narcotic arrests. So he was all about quotas. But the sad thing of it is that he was not supposed to be arresting people or even having people in his boat. He was supposed to be out there just to be seen. And that's the sad thing of this whole deal. And Clarity, who I believe can't swim, who was his boss at the time, he's responsible for putting him out there and letting him do what he was doing. The guy was incapable. He was the poorest swimmer in his class. And, it's, if you just take a look at the guy, that he was in horrendous shape and he shouldn't have been out there. So, and Brandon was at a disadvantage from the get-go,
Well, and just to revisit this article again, just in the first paragraph of this, it says that the judge, let's see, a former state highway patrol trooper was driving a boat when handcuffed. Judge fell out and drowned. Has dismissed 3 lawsuits he filed over losing his law enforcement license. Okay, the reason that those lawsuits were dismissed was so that he could collect back pay. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So. Yeah.
Here's the deal on that, George. He was fired by Sandra Carstens, who was at that time, she was head of the highway patrol when Piercy was fired. So I filed a complaint on him to get fired, and I filed a complaint on him to lose his license. Well, they didn't. This was after the criminal hearings, and he was, he took that misdemeanor and got 10 days in jail and probation. But, the highway patrol could have filed a complaint too, but they chose not to. And they could have also taken his license, which they chose not to, but I had to do it. So I went ahead and did it. And the sad thing is when he got fired, and then they had a inner troop meeting. They had like 6 troop people from different troops coming in. They had a meeting. Sandra Carson was involved with it. And I think there was a few other witnesses, like Tracy McGinnis was one of their attorneys, and they voted 6-0 to give him back pay and to reinstate him. But she overrode him and fired him, which I do honestly believe and know that she knew she couldn't do that, and it was against the law. But she did it anyway, just to make it look good. And but as we went further down the road, we got his license taken away probably 6 months later. And then he couldn't work anymore. Actually, I don't think he was working after he got charged with manslaughter. It's been a while since this has all happened. But the deal with the back pay is you have to have a license to be working as a trooper out on the road.
Right.
And for him to get back pay, and he hasn't had his license since 2017. I don't know how they legally could get him paid by even reinstating him, because if they reinstated him and he got paid as a trooper, he didn't have his license, so legally he couldn't be paid because he wasn't a trooper at the time. So there's some legalities there that they skirted, you know. I don't know. I know a few reporters are looking into it, to the details, to see what they actually did do. But I know he was paid $126,000, I think, by probably the Highway Patrol, and I think the DPS, Department of Public Safety, who Sandra Carson's now heads up, paid him some more money to equal a total of about $219,000. So.
Well, this story does not end. It will never end for you, obviously, and I'm going to continue to follow it. There will probably be further development. This guy now, he's done. He's out of the picture. As far as punishing him is concerned, that's not going to bring Brandon back, obviously, but some justice needs to be served here. I think some of the bigger picture justice would be changing the way that these patrols are done and the way people are trained, and how these cases are processed. Do you have any knowledge of that? Has there been any good come out of this at all along those lines?
To my knowledge, you know, I don't know the inner workings of what they were supposed to do. I know within his criminal thing, they agreed to, or not the criminal thing, but I think on the lawsuit thing that we filed civilly, they agreed to do certain things and to update us, and that's never been done. So, but you know, that's one of the most dangerous lakes in the country, and really what they need to do is have two people on a boat, you know, and it's just an unfortunate tragedy the whole way around. I mean, they were trying to, after it happened, they just tried to shove it under the rug and smear Brandon, make it look like he was at fault. And clearly Brandon wasn't, you know. And I have a video of Brandon 5 minutes before Piercy picked him up, of him getting on the boat at Coconuts and telling everybody what to do. And Brandon, you can tell Brandon he's in charge, and he's not what they said he was. And I'm just glad I have that, because, you know, they lied and said Brandon was slobbering and all that. There's no way on earth, you know. I don't believe the Highway Patrol, they're a really pretty evil, dirty institution. I'm sure there's a lot of good guys that work in it, but their upper management that at that time was awful, you know.
Well, the image that I have seared into my mind always will be a photo, and I don't know where it came from exactly, but it's a photo of him in the boat, sitting there upright, alert, compliant, polite looking, you know, just before the horrible incident. Well, so I'm going to give you the last word on this, Craig. What's next, if anything? Is there more to come on this, or is this going to be it for a while, do you think?
Well, Randy Henry has a case going on now, and you know, Randy was basically told to transfer, or he was going to be, you know, not have a job. So Randy had enough time in, he could retire, so he just retired. But they had transferred him and made him drive 90 miles a day back and forth for about a year as retaliation. They say it's not, but that's what it was for being a whistleblower for Brandon.
No, okay, and, so explain that a little bit. Randy's role in this.
Well, Randy was he wasn't actually Piercy's boss on the water, but he did help training a little bit, and you know, and he was the one that wrote the letter to Clarity saying that Piercy's only thing he can do is to be seen and go from point A to point B. That's the only approval of the Water Patrol that Henry approved Piercy to do. and Clarity basically didn't enforce it. And Clarity was his boss, Lieutenant Clarity. So, but anyway, Randy was involved with it the night that it happened. Randy was the first guy I talked to, and told me about it. And he didn't know anything of what had actually really happened. But later that evening, Piercy had called Henry, telling him what happened. And based on that, Henry told him, he said, you need to get a good attorney and quit talking. And Piercy told Henry's that, no, I don't need to. Rapogle said I'll be fine. He was the head of the highway patrol at the time. And so that's how it all started. And then when the coroner's inquest came around, Randy figured they'd ask him to testify, and they never did. And so that's when Randy went out and over their heads and got involved. He actually talked to my attorney, Bowles. So that was when it all started. And Randy said, they're going to try and cover this thing up. And that's what they were trying to do. And that's exactly. So Randy went over their heads, and that's kind of how it all went down from there. And then they just really, once they found out it was Randy, it was all, they went after him with a vengeance, but anyway, he's got a trial coming up. It got thrown out, and he appealed it just so he could have his trial. So they're waiting to hear back from I think it's circuit court. I don't know which circuit it is. It's 7th or 8th court. But once he finds that out, that he can have his trial and day in court, there's going to be a lot of dirt that comes out. And I really don't think they want it out there, because he's got so much dirt on him, it's not even funny. So,
well, could be we'll revisit then. That'll be a reason to come back and chat with you again. I'm going to
exactly
wrap this one up for now, Craig. And I don't. This platform is good for you. I mean, this reaches a lot of people, and a lot of people are concerned about this case. A lot of people are concerned about you. What would you say in closing to people that are getting the update now on the Brandon Ellingson saga, the tragedy in the Heartland?
Well, I think out of all this, I've shown that Brandon wasn't at fault of any of this. I mean, he was innocent from day one on this thing. He was just out there, and I don't think Brandon ever thought that this would ever happen. But it just goes to show you that when you come in contact with police, you have to think about your safety, and always be careful about what you say. And also, they can lie to you at any time. So you need to know that they can lie to make you talk. Although in this case, that wasn't the issue, but we were lied to a lot by what they said. The boys were lied that day on what was wrong with Brandon was already dead, and they were telling the boys he was in jail. So that's an instance right there where they can lie. So.
Well, I appreciate you coming on again. This is just a story that's heavy on my heart, always will be. And because he was a hockey player, a lot of the guys that I play men's league with know him and remember him well. A young man in the prime of life, getting ready to go to university down there. And he was headed off to Arizona, wasn't he, Craig?
Yeah, he was at Arizona State. He was finished with his second year, and he was just getting ready to go on a cruise for business credits for Arizona State's business college. And there was about 500 kids they were going to be on a cruise with that next week for the whole summer. So he wasn't able to obviously go because of what happened. So, but Brandon will live on, and he was tragically killed by someone in an organization who should have been taking care of him. So anyway, it's just a terrible thing, that happened. But one day I'll see Brandon again, and he knows that I fought for him, the truth did come out. So,
well, we know too, and it means a lot, and I appreciate
Yep.
it. And thanks again. We'll circle back. All right, folks.
You
That's
bet.
the tragic story, the latest update with Brandon Ellingson. We've been talking today with Craig Ellingson, his father. We're going to close it up for right now. Encourage everybody, if you're watching this on YouTube, if you like the podcast, ring that bell to subscribe to the podcast so that you get each and every one. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Spotify, all of the various platforms where you can find Podcasts by George. And we'll have some good news for you in the next podcast. Not so much for this one. Right now, that's another podcast by George.